Oh, Oguguo, she cried out, her voice filled with anguish. Oguguo, I swear by the gods, you will suffer for the pain you have caused me. You will suffer for this pain you have caused me. The water, the land, the forests, and all of nature shall turn against you, and they shall fight you for what you've done. I loved you sincerely with all my heart. King Ike was termed a weak man by the villagers of Udi because of his inability to tame and control his only son. He allowed his son become a nuisance in the community. Here is why. For over 15 years, King Ike and Queen Uche had longed for a child. They prayed and offered lots of sacrifices, hoping that one day their dreams would come true. It took a very long time, but finally, after what seemed like an eternity, their prayers were answered. They were blessed with a baby boy, whom they named Oguguo, meaning my consoler. This child was their greatest joy, the light of their lives. Because they had waited so long for him, they cherished him more than anything in the world, and they pampered Oguguo so much, never finding faults in anything he did. He was the apple of their eyes, and in their eyes he could do no wrong. From the moment he was born, they showered him with love and gifts, hoping to make up for all the years they had waited for him. But this constant pampering had a dangerous consequences. Oguguo grew into a spoilt child, extremely rude and arrogant. He insulted everyone, speaking harshly to the servants, refusing to listen to his teachers and demanding his way in every situation. But instead of correcting his behavior, the king and queen would simply wave and dismiss it, saying, "He's just a child and would grow out of it." They were too soft on him, and anyone who dared to discipline the young prince quickly found themselves facing the king and queen's fury. "Do you know how long we waited to have him?" they would shout angrily, defending Oguguo's bad behavior as if it were a badge of honor. The king and queen's fierce protectiveness made it clear to everyone in the palace that the prince was untouchable. As a result, Oguguo became known as a very naughty and troublesome child, and most people in the palace and village began to avoid him. The servants would quickly step aside whenever he passed, not wanting to become the target of his tantrums or sharp tongue. And whenever he rode through the village, everyone would clear the road in order not to face his scary temper. They thought that the older he got, he would become better. But no, rather he became worse. He grew wilder and more uncontrollable with each passing year, pushing the boundaries further and further. It came to a point when not even the king or queen could caution him or guide him. Oguguo had become so used to doing whatever he pleased that he no longer listened to anyone, not even his own parents. He would storm through the palace, making demands and causing chaos, with no one daring to stand in his way. The prince's power and freedom seemed limitless, and everyone knew that whatever Oguguo wanted, he would get, no matter the cost. Notwithstanding his arrogant nature, Oguguo was an extremely handsome man. He had a strong, tall frame that was intimidating and eyes that sparkled like the sun on a clear day. His beauty was so captivating that people couldn't help but stare in awe whenever they saw him. Some villagers even whispered that Oguguo might have come from the water, as his beauty was so rare and otherworldly. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone in the village, from the youngest children to the oldest elders. The entire village of Udi buzzed with stories and admiration for the prince, and his name was on everyone's lips, a source of endless fascination and wonder. But his beauty was just outer. He had a very disgusting character. He was so arrogant, and the entire village lived in fear and terror of him. No matter what he did, still, no one dared to utter a single word, or you would be punished severely. He felt so high and mighty that anything he wanted was what he got. In addition to his arrogance, the prince had a deep and insatiable desire for women. He believed that all the maidens in the village should be at his beck and call. He went for any maiden that caught his eyes and easily discarded them when he had had his fill. Many of the maidens in the village, knowing how cruel he is, still wanted to be with him. Yes, he had a charming look and all, but most of all, they wanted to be the next queen. The glory that comes with it, the beautiful dresses, the breathtaking mansion. They would always say that it's better to cry in a mansion than a hut. Therefore, easily, they fell for his fake promises to marry them, and anyone who refused him was brutally tortured by him. Prince Oguguo had no intention of settling down with any of them. One by one, the maidens found themselves in his arms, hoping to become something more to him. But once the prince had satisfied his desires, he would discard them without a second thought, treating them as if they were nothing more than trash to be thrown away. The maidens would weep and plead, doing everything they could think of to win back his love. They would offer gifts, sing him songs, and even kneel at his feet, begging him to reconsider. But the prince, with a heart as cold as stone, would hardly spare them a glance. How do you ever think I would end up with one woman? Let alone a commoner like you, he would scold with a mocking laughter. Ah, look around the village. There are so many beautiful maidens, and I want them all. To him, it was all a game, and the maidens were simply pieces on a board that he could move around as he pleased. No one in the village of Udi was happy with the way Prince Oguguo behaved. His attitude was a source of concern for everyone, but they were all too scared to say anything to him or complain to the king. The prince had become someone who demanded respect but offered none in return. He walked through the village with an air of arrogance, treating others as if they were beneath him, and no one could stop him. The villagers whispered among themselves whenever he passed, wishing that someone would have the courage to confront him. But they knew better than to speak out. The prince was not just a powerful figure, he was also unpredictable, and no one wanted to risk his wrath. The king and queen, now realizing their mistakes, watched in despair as their beloved son seemed to spiral further and further out of control. Every day, they saw how Oguguo's actions hurt the people around him, and it broke their hearts. Yet, despite their deep love for him, they felt powerless to change the situation. The prince had no respect for anyone, not even his own parents. if the king or queen tried to talk to him or guide him, Oguguo would simply brush them off, acting as if their words meant nothing. This lack of regard was like a knife to their hearts, causing them endless worry and sleepless nights. Sometimes, as they lay awake in the dark, the king and queen would whisper to each other, sharing their regrets. "We should have raised him differently," they would say, their voices filled with sorrow. They knew that Oguguo was the future of the Ude kingdom, the one who would sit on the throne and lead their people. But how could he lead when he was so irresponsible, so careless with the feelings and lives of others? One scorching afternoon, when the sun was blazing high in the sky, Prince Oguguo decided to cool off by heading down to the stream with his servants. The prince had always loved the feeling of cool water on his skin, especially during the hot weather. In fact, it had become a part of his daily routine to visit the stream, where he could escape the heat and enjoy the refreshing embrace of the water. As he waded into the stream, letting the coolness of the water wash over him, he felt a sense of peace. But just as he was beginning to relax, something, or rather someone, caught his eye. There, not too far from where he stood, was a girl, more beautiful than anyone he had ever seen. Her beauty was so striking that it made his heart skip a beat. He whistled softly to himself, hardly believing what he was seeing. The maiden seemed to glow under the sun, her features so perfect that she looked almost like a dream. Is she from this village? Oguguo wondered, puzzled that he had never noticed her before. He prided himself on knowing all the maidens in the village, but this very one was new to him. As he watched her gracefully lift her water onto her head and began to walk away, he made a decision. I must have her. Without wasting a moment, he turned to one of his guards after she had left and said, "Follow her. Find out where she lives." The next morning, Prince Oguguo had gathered all the information he needed. Meanwhile, the beautiful maiden, whose name was Chisom, was completely unaware of the prince's intention. She had only recently arrived in the village and was just beginning to settle in. She had lived with her grandmother all her life, taking care of her. But now that she was dead, she had nowhere else to go than to return to her parents. That morning, she was outside her small hut, sweeping the front yard, when she noticed something unusual: a royal carriage approaching her home. Chisom's heart began to race as the carriage came to a stop in front of her. A servant stepped out holding a basket filled with fruits and flowers. He walked up to her with a serious expression and said, "The prince demands to meet you by the river at noon today." He then handed her the basket, which was overflowing with ripe, juicy fruits and colorful, fragrant flowers. "Me?" Chisom asked in disbelief, her eyes wide with surprise. "Are you sure you are in the right place? I just arrived this village a few days ago, and I've never met the prince." She couldn't understand why the prince would want to see her, a stranger who had only just come to the village. But the servant nodded firmly. "The prince saw you at the river yesterday, and he was smitten by your beauty. He wishes to see you today." Chisom was stunned. She had heard stories about the prince and his way with women, but she never imagined she would be the one to catch his eye. Yet, who was she to refuse the prince? The idea of meeting him filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. All her life, she had imagined being a queen. Taking the basket, she nodded and said, "I'll be there at the scheduled time." As the carriage drove away, Chisom stood there for a moment, clutching the basket and trying to process what had just happened. The prince wanted to meet her, an ordinary girl who had only just arrived the village. What would he be like? What did he want from her? With these questions swelling in her mind, Chisom began to prepare herself for the meeting that would soon change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. Chisom's life had always been shaped by hardship. Her parents were very poor, and she had spent most of her childhood living with her grandmother, who had recently died. Chisom had only just returned to the village herself, hoping to start anew. When the message came that the prince wanted to meet her, she found herself both excited and anxious. She stood in her small humble hut, staring at her clothes, unsure of what to wear. She knew that she needed to look her best for the prince, but her wardrobe was far from fancy. With a sigh, she finally picked out the nicest dress she owned, though it was simple and worn from use. As she began her walk down the village road, the scorching sun beat down on her, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the upcoming meeting with the prince. What will I say to him? She wondered over and over. She had never met the prince before, but she had heard countless stories about him. How incredibly handsome he was, and how he captured the attention of every maiden in the village. Her emotions were a confusing mix of fear and excitement. Should she be nervous about meeting such a powerful figure, or should she feel thrilled at the chance to be at his presence? Finally, after what felt like hours, Chisom reached the stream where she was supposed to meet the prince. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw the royal horses grazing nearby, a clear sign that the prince was already there. Am I late? She worried, quickening her pace. But just as she approached the water's edge, a tall figure emerged from the shade of a tree. He stood before her, his face lit up with a charming, beautiful smile. "Greetings, my lady," the prince said as he stepped forward to meet her. Chisom's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anyone so handsome in her entire life. The prince was not just handsome, he was absolutely gorgeous, with features so perfect that it seemed almost unreal. Her heart began to flutter, and she could hardly believe that this man, who looked so kind and innocent, was the same person she had heard the village girls gossip about. Just the other day, she had overheard some girls at the river talking badly about the prince, saying he was cruel and only cared about himself. But looking at him now, standing before her with such a warm and welcoming smile, Chisom couldn't imagine how anyone could say such mean things about him. He didn't seem like someone who could hurt a fly, let alone break someone's heart. Maybe those girls were just jealous because they couldn't win his attention. She thought, her doubts melting away as she smiled back at him. The two of them spent the afternoon sitting under the shade of a large tree by the river, talking and laughing together. The prince was so easy to talk to, and Chisom found herself enjoying every single moment. He told her stories about the palace, and she shared tales of her life in the village. They laughed when one of them said something funny, and the sound of their laughter echoed through the peaceful surroundings. For Chisom, it felt like a dream. a perfect moment she never wanted to end. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, signaling the end of their meeting, the prince called one of his guards over and instructed him to escort Chisom home on one of the royal horses. As she rode back to her hut, Chisom couldn't stop smiling and thinking about the prince. His handsome features, his kind words, and the way he made her feel so special. All of it replayed in her mind like a sweet melody. She was certain now that the village girls must have been wrong about him. How could someone so gentle and wonderful be anything like the person they had described? As the horse trotted down the dusty road, Chisom's heart swelled with happiness. She felt a connection with the prince that she had never felt with anyone before, and she couldn't help it but smile as she thought about the possibility of seeing him again. Maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. Chisom was in the small smoky kitchen, busy preparing dinner for her parents. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the sky was growing darker by the minute. She knew her parents would be home soon, tired and hungry from their long day of work. She needed to hurry. But her mind kept drifting back to the time she had spent with Prince Oguguo by the river. She had been so caught up in the excitement of the meeting that she had completely lost track of time. Now, with the shadows of evening settling in, she was rushing to finish the meal before her parents arrived. As Chisom stirred the pot of soup, she suddenly heard the sound of footsteps approaching the hut. The footsteps were quick and light, and soon a familiar voice called out, "Chisom! Chisom!" Recognizing the voice, Chisom smiled to herself and called back from the kitchen, "Ebi, Kekwanu," meaning "How are you?" It was her cousin Ebere, who was always full of energy and always seemed to have something to say. "I'm fine, no," Ebere responded, her voice bright as she entered the small kitchen. But Chisom could tell from the look on Ebere's face that she had something on her mind. Ebere's usually cheerful expression was replaced with a serious one, and Chisom could sense that whatever she had to say was important. "What's that look, Ebere?" Chisom asked. Her curiosity piqued as she glanced up from her cooking. She could see that Ebere was trying to gather her thoughts, as if unsure how to begin. Finally, Ebere took a deep breath and said, Chisom, I heard you were with the prince at the river today." Her tone was cautious, as if she was afraid of how Chisom might react. Chisom felt a small laugh escape her lips. "It's like you all gossip a lot in this village," she replied, shaking her head with a smile. It didn't surprise her that the news of her meeting with the prince had already spread. In a village as small as theirs, word traveled fast, especially when it involved someone as important as the prince. But Ebere wasn't laughing. She looked at Chisom with concern in her eyes. "That's not the point," she said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Prince Oguguo is a wicked man. He has broken and toyed with the hearts of so many girls in this village. He's not what he seems. At first, he might look like an angel, but I tell you, my sister, that man is more than evil. Can you believe that he had promised almost all the girls in this village marriage?" Chisom fell silent for a moment, absorbing Ebere's words. She had heard the rumors about the prince before, but she hadn't given them much thought. Now, hearing the warning from Ebere, someone she trusted, made her heart pause. After a moment, she looked at Ebere and asked quietly, Has he ever broken your heart? Ebere shook her head. No, but he has done that with so many maidens in this village. I love you so much, Chisom, and I would not like you to go through any form of heartbreak. Chisom could see the worry in Ebere's eyes, and she appreciated her cousin's concern. But deep down, Chisom didn't believe that the prince was as bad as everyone said. Ebere, you worry too much, she said gently. I don't think Oguguo is that kind of man. Besides, he may have changed. You don't need to worry about me. I appreciate your concern, and I promise I will be fine. Mine might be different, even if the rumors are true. Ebere wasn't convinced, but she could see that Chisom had already made up her mind. With a reluctant nod, she said, I hope you know what you are doing, Chisom. I just don't want to see you get hurt. Chisom smiled and gave Ebere a reassuring hug. Thank you, Ebere. I will be careful, I promise. But even as they stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, both girls knew that only time would tell whether Chisom's fate in the prince was well placed, or if she would become another broken heart in the long list of those left in his wake. Ebere's worries lingered, and as she left the hut that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that her cousin was stepping into dangerous waters. The relationship between Chisom and Prince Oguguo blossomed like a flower in the warm sun. To the prince, Chisom was different from other girls he had met. It was so easy for him to get other girls on his bed, and that was what he always wanted. But Chisom had refused many of his advances. She told him that she wanted to keep her virginity until she got married. This didn't go down well with him, but he decided to be patient. Each day, Oguguo would make sure to meet her by the stream, where they would spend hours talking and laughing together. Their time together became the highlight of Chisom's day, and the prince never came empty-handed. He showered her with gifts, beautiful beads, fine fabrics, and sweet-smelling oils that made Chisom feel special and cherished, which was his intention. Soon, she began to believe that what they had was something real, something that could last forever. It wasn't long before people began to notice a thing between these two. The other girls who had once sought the prince's attention now whispered amongst themselves. They wondered if Chisom had given the prince a love potion, something to make him forget all the other maidens and focus only on her. But how else could they explain the prince's sudden devotion? Deep down, Oguguo had an ulterior motive. His patience had begun to wear thin, even though he continued to assure her that he respected her wishes and could wait until they got married. In truth, he was really growing frustrated. He had never been with one woman for this long. When he realized that Chisom was truly determined to keep her promise, he decided it was time for a different approach. One day, as they sat together on the grassy bank of the river, chatting and laughing as they always did, Prince Oguguo brought up something he had been thinking about for a long time. He had been patient, but now he felt it was time to take things a step further. With a gentle smile, he looked at Chisom and said, Chisom, I have a very special place I would love to show you. Would you come with me tomorrow? Chisom's heart leaped with excitement. The thought of seeing a special place with the prince filled her with joy. Yes, my prince, she replied eagerly. I would love to see this special place. The next day, Chisom woke up early, her heart full of anticipation. She dressed in her best outfit, imagining all the wonderful sights she would see. As they set out together, she could barely contain her excitement. She was sure that whatever the prince had in mind would be nothing short of magical. But as they walked, she soon began to notice that something was off. The path they took wasn't leading to a beautiful garden or a secret waterfall as she had imagined. Instead, they wandered into a secluded, quiet area in the forest, far from the village and the bustling life she was used to. The wonderful sight she had hoped for never appeared, and a sense of unease began to creep into her heart. As they reached their destination, Chisom looked around, confused and a little afraid. She trusted the prince, but something about this place didn't feel right. They finally stopped in the middle of the forest, and there in the forest lay a small hut. The prince stopped and they both alighted. He held her hand and led her into the hut. The room looked strange. "What are we doing here?" Chisom asked, wondering why a house was in the forest. Oguguo stared into her eyes. Chisom could see fire in his eyes as he immediately shut the small door and pushed her to the hard floor. Then she realized what was happening. "Please, Oguguo," she cried. "Don't do this to me." But before she could finish speaking, Prince Oguguo's face turned cold, and without any warning, he violently grabbed her, tearing her clothes from her body. Chisom tried to scream, tried to push him away, but he was too strong. Recklessly, he forced himself into her, ignoring her cries and pleas for him to stop. The pain was unbearable, and her voice echoed through the forest, shaking it from its roots. But Oguguo didn't care. He was immersed in a pleasure that caused her pain, focusing on satisfying his own desires. When he was done, he didn't say a word. He simply got up, dressed himself, and ordered her to dress up. Without even looking at her, he drove her back to the village on a horse. Once they had gotten to the familiar dusty road, he left her there, shattered and broken, forcing her to walk home alone in the dark, with nothing but her pain and shame to keep her company. As she stumbled through the village, the horrifying truth hit her like stone. All the warnings, all the things people had said about the prince, they were all true. So sorry it took her this long to find out that Oguguo was not the kind, charming man she had believed him to be. He was evil, and she had been nothing more than a conquest to him. She realized with a sinking heart that he had been with her all this while because she had refused to sleep with him. The moment he got what he wanted, see how he discarded her like she meant nothing. Chisom had lost her virginity in the worst way imaginable, and the pain of that loss consumed her. For days, she stayed inside her hut crying until she had no more tears. The pain was too much to bear, and the betrayal cut deep into her heart. But even as she lay there broken and alone, the prince never came to see her, never sent any message to check on her. He was done with her, and he had already moved on, leaving Chisom to deal with the heartbreak and pain all by herself. She knew now that nothing would ever be the same again. The bright future she had once dreamed of was gone, replaced by a deep, dark sadness that she couldn't escape. Chisom was left to pick up the pieces of her life, knowing that the world she once known had been changed forever. Outside the safety of her small hut, Chisom had no idea what awaited her. She had spent days locked away inside, mourning her heartbreak and keeping the terrible secret of what had happened. She didn't tell anyone about her pain, not even her closest friend, who was her cousin Eberi. But Chisom knew she couldn't stay hidden indoors forever. Life in the village went on, and eventually she would have to face the world again. But it never occurred to her that things had changed. One evening, when the sun was beginning to set, Chisom decided to fetch some water from the river. It was a simple task, one she had done many times before, but this time felt different. As she walked along the dusty village road, she could feel the eyes of the other villagers on her. Their stares were sharp and cold, making her feel small and exposed. She tried to ignore them, but the feeling of being watched made her heart race with anxiety. When Chisom finally reached the river, she hoped she could quietly fetch her water and leave. But as soon as the village girls saw her, they burst into cruel laughter. "Yanga has ended," one of them shouted, mocking her. "So after everything, he still dumped her," another added, her voice filled with spite. The girls continued to taunt her, their words cutting deep into Chisom's already wounded heart. What was she thinking? That he would make her the queen? One of them sneered, causing the others to burst into laughter again. Does she even know how many ladies in this village that he had promised to make queens? I even heard he had moved on. Oh, poor thing. Their laughter was loud and cruel, echoing across the river, and it felt like knives being driven into Chisom's chest. Chisom's eyes filled with tears as she listened to their mocking voices. The shame and pain she felt were too much for her to bear. It was as if the whole world was against her, and she felt completely alone. She couldn't stay there any longer, couldn't stand to hear their cruel words for another second. The pain was overwhelming, and in that moment, all she wanted to do was escape. Without thinking, Chisom dropped her water pot and ran all the way into the forest. She ran until she couldn't hear the girls' laughter anymore, until she found a quiet spot where she could be alone with her tears. There, hidden among the trees, she sat down and cried. She wailed loudly, pouring all her pain, heartbreak and tears on the soil of the forest, until she had no more tears left. When night drew near, she gently walked back home, her chest still heavy, and quietly she slipped into her hut. A few weeks later, Chisom fell ill. It started as a simple tiredness, but soon it grew worse. She felt weak all the time, and her energy seemed to drain away. Her mother Obiageli could not stop worrying about her beloved daughter. Day and night, she boiled herbs, making Chisom drink bitter concoctions in the hope that they would make her feel better. But no matter what Obiageli did, Chisom's condition didn't improve. The sickness clung to her like a shadow, and Obiageli's heart grew heavy with fear. One morning, as they were both in the kitchen, Obiageli noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. She saw subtle changes in Chisom's body, the slight swelling of her belly and feet and the fullness in her face. A suspicion began to form in her mind, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She turned to her daughter, her eyes narrowing as she asked, "Chisom, are you pregnant?" Chisom's heart raced at her mother's question. "Pregnant, Mama? Not pregnant though," she replied, quickly trying to dismiss the idea. But Obiageli wasn't convinced. The signs were there, and as a mother she knew what they meant. As a young girl in Udi, Being pregnant was a taboo, and any girl found was cast out of the village, as they felt that she was a bad example to the others. Tears filled Obegili's eyes as Chisom was her only daughter. "Why have you decided to bring shame to me, Chisom?" Obegili's voice was filled with pain and anger. "Chisom, you are pregnant. Look at you." "Why?" "Chisom, you know the laws of our land, don't you? Tell me, who is responsible for your pregnancy?" Chisom stood frozen, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had only been with one man, and if she was truly pregnant, then there could be only one father. "I said, who is responsible?" Obiageli questioned her angrily. Her voice trembled as she whispered, Oguguo," the name escaping her lips like a confession. Obiageli's eyes widened in shock. "Which Oguguo?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chisom nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. The weight of her situation crashed down on her, and she saw the horror in her mother's face. "Hey!" Obiageli exclaimed, clutching her chest. "I am a finished woman. I am finished. What do we do? How do we confront the royal house? Chisom, you know we are a nobody. Why Oguguo? Chisom, why?" So the rumors were true. Obiageli fell to the floor, clutching her chest, as she cried bitterly. That evening, Chisom knew she had to face the prince. She could not bear to bring this shame upon her family. She hoped that he would take responsibility for her and her unborn child. If the contrary happens, her family will be disgraced, and no one ever wished to go through this. As she walked down the village road towards the palace, her heart was heavy with dread. She prayed silently that the prince would show mercy, that he would remember the love he had once claimed to have for her. But even as she prayed, fear gnawed at her. She still felt weak from her illness, but she forced herself to keep moving, each step feeling like it might be her last. When she reached the palace gate, the guards stopped her. "I want to see the prince," she cried out, her voice desperate and trembling. But the guards didn't budge. They blocked her way, refusing to let her in. Panic seized her, and she began to scream at the top of her lungs, calling for the prince, hoping he would hear her. Her cries echoed through the palace grounds, and just as she was about to lose hope, the prince himself appeared. He was stepping out, likely heading for another one of his leisurely outings, when he heard the familiar voice at the gate. "Let her in," he commanded, and the guards immediately stepped aside. Chisom walked into the palace compound, her legs trembling beneath her. As she approached the prince, she could feel his cold, piercing gaze on her. The warmth and charm she had once known in him were gone, replaced by an icy indifference. This wasn't the Oguguo she had spent those sweet afternoons with by the river. This was the cruel, heartless prince the village girls had warned her about. "So, how may I help you?" Prince Oguguo's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were speaking to a stranger, not the girl he had once promised to marry. Chisom knew she had to get straight to the point. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The prince didn't react. He stood there, expressionless, as if she hadn't spoken at all. "I am pregnant," she repeated, louder this time, her voice shaking. "And I don't understand why you're telling me this," the prince sneered. "Why don't you go to the bastard's father and tell him you are pregnant. Chisom's heart sank. You are the father, my prince. You are the only man who has ever been with me. A sudden fury fled in the prince's eyes. Will you shut that crap up? He thundered, his voice echoing through the courtyard. So you think I don't see the way you frolic with other men in this village? You think I don't see it? And now, you want to pin your bastard on me. Look, I know you are a slut, and you can't fool me with your fake innocent tears. Tears streamed down Chisom's face as she went down on her knees. My prince, remember how you said you loved me. Remember how you promised to marry me. You can't do this to me. You know the law of our land. I will be openly disgraced and cast out. Please, save me from this shame, she cried. But the prince only laughed, a harsh mocking sound that cut through her like a knife. You should have thought about that when you went about opening your legs for any Tom, Dick and Harry. You must be joking. Have you ever taken a look at yourself? I, Prince Oguguo, the heir of the throne of Udi, marry you. Remind me who you are again. Can your cursed womb ever carry my child? He turned to the guards, his voice cold and commanding. Guards, throw her out. As the guards moved to obey, the prince pointed at Chisom with a look of pure contempt. And you, he spat, find the father of your bastard, and I'll kill you if I ever see you anywhere near this palace again. If you can't face the shame, you might as well get rid of it. Chisom's world crumbled around her as the guards roughly grabbed her arms and dragged her out of the palace. Her pleas, her cries for mercy fell on deaf ears. To the prince, she was nothing more than a nuisance, a problem to be discarded. And so, Chisom was thrown out of the palace like she was nothing, her dreams shattered, her heart broken and her future uncertain. In her pain, Chisom found herself wandering to the forest, a place she often went when she needed to cry. It was a quiet, secluded spot where she could pour out her emotions without anyone seeing. She sat down on a fallen log, her loud cries echoing through the trees with a heavy bitterness. The forest seemed to listen to her grief, the rustling leaves and chirping birds growing quiet as if in sympathy. Oh, Oguguo, she cried out, her voice filled with anguish. Oguguo, I swear by the gods, you will suffer for the pain you have caused me. You will suffer for this pain you have caused me. The water, the land, the forests, and all of nature shall turn against you, and they shall fight you for what you've done. I loved you sincerely with all my heart, and you took away my innocence in the most painful way. From this day forward, may pain be your only companion. Her words were a curse born of deep pain and sorrow. She spoke with the raw emotion of someone who had lost everything. As she sat there, Chisom felt the cool breeze brush against her face, as if the forest itself had stamped her words. As night approached, Chisom cried all the way back home. Her heart was heavy with sorrow and betrayal. The weight of what had happened was more than she could bear, and she began to wish she had listened to Iberi's warning. As the tears streamed down uncontrollably, she felt an overwhelming sense of regret and despair. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have trusted the prince with all her heart, only to have it shattered so cruelly? When she finally returned home, exhausted from crying, Chisom knew she had to tell her parents what had happened. Her father, Obiageli's husband, listened in stern silence. As she recounted her encounter with the prince, the anger in his eyes grew with every word until it blazed like a fire. "You mean the prince threw you out of the palace?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. "He thinks I'm like the other men in this village, that he can treat their daughters like this and get away with it. They make the law and they defile it. He will see. I will deal with him." That evening, driven by his fury and injustice done to his daughter, Chisom's father gathered his wife and some of his kinsmen. Together they marched to the palace, determined to confront the king and demand justice. The group stormed through the village, their anger palpable, ready to stand up to the prince who had wronged them. But when they arrived at the palace, their demands were met with cold indifference. Oguguo, who had already shown his cruel side to Chisom, ordered his men to flog them with a whip and drive them away. The guards followed the prince's command, descending on Chisom's parents and the kinsmen with merciless strokes of cane. The whips cracked through the air, leaving painful welts on their backs as they were brutally thrown out of the palace. With pain searing their body and hearts, heavy with the sting of humiliation, they made the long walk back home. Chisom's heart ached even more when she heard how the prince had treated her parents. The pain she felt was no longer just for herself, but for her family, who had been dragged into this nightmare because of her. She wished more that she had listened. Not knowing what else to do, Chisom's parents hid her indoors. They didn't want the villagers to find out that she was pregnant. But in the small town of Udi, nothing could stay hidden, and Chisom knew this. She couldn't bear to face the shame and ridicule. They had gone through enough. In the quiet of her room that night, Chisom made a decision. She needed to leave, to find a place far away where no one knew her, where she could start anew without the weight of her past hanging over. Chisom packed her few belongings with her, her heart heavy with sorrow, but resolute in her decision. With a final glance at the home she had always known, Chisom set out on a journey into the unknown. Many years passed, and Oguguo had ascended the throne by this time, now becoming the king of Udi. One would think that life would have taught him a lesson, but no, it hadn't changed a bit over the years, and he ruled with arrogance and iron fist. But as so many years flew by, life began to humble him. His life, once filled with the pleasures of youth and power, had taken a different turn. He had married several women over the years, but something important was missing: a son to inherit his throne. The palace was filled with the laughter and chatter of children, but they were all daughters. No matter how many wives he took, no matter how many prayers were said, a son was never born to him. When his last wife gave birth to twin daughters, his heart was shattered, and he ripped his garments into pieces as he cried bitterly. He now had 40 daughters in total. 40! What have I done to deserve this? He cried. As the years flew by, Oguguo's heart grew heavier, pressing down on him like a great weight. The older he became, the more desperate he felt. What was he going to do? His heart was sinking deeper into despair with each passing day. Without a son, his royal line would end and the throne of Udi would pass to another. The thought of losing the throne tormented him, driving him closer to madness. He had sought the gods severally, but they were silent on him. In his desperation, Oguguo decided that he needed to seek a powerful chief priest. Perhaps they could offer an explanation, a solution to the curse that seemed to hang over his life. He gathered the elders of the village, wise men who had advised kings for generations. Together they discussed the matter, their faces lined with worry. After much deliberation, they decided to seek for the most powerful chief priest in the region, a man known for his ability to communicate with the gods and could provide answers to the most difficult problems. It was a daunting task. They traveled across mountains and hills, but finally they found one. They set a date on the sacred day of Eke for the chief priest to come to the palace and perform the necessary rituals. On the appointed day, the chief priest arrived at the palace. He was an old man, his face withered by years of service to the gods. He spread his mat in the center of the palace, and the king, along with the elders, gathered around him, their eyes filled with hope and fear. The air was thick with tension as the chief priest began to chant his incantations, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to reach beyond the walls of the palace and into the spirit world. Time stretched on as the chief priest performed his ritual. The king's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the urgency of his situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chief priest fell silent. He looked up from his mat, his gaze locking onto the king's eyes. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone waited for his words. "You can never have another son," the chief priest said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made the king and the elders shudder. "Another son?" they repeated, looking at each other, their voices tinged with confusion and disbelief. Was this chief priest drunk? The king didn't even have a son to begin with. What could he possibly mean? The king's voice broke through the silence filled with desperation. "I don't even have any son before now. If I did, will I be looking for answers? All I need is just one heir, one who could take over me when I'm no more. Please, ask the gods. Ask them to tell me what to do," he pleaded, his eyes wide with fear. The chief priest shook his head solemnly. "I said another son because you already have one," he explained. "What?" everyone exclaimed. The chief priest continued. "A long time ago, you were with a maiden from this village. She was pregnant with your child, but you threw her out. You denied her, and you tortured her parents. She cursed you in her pains. And because of that curse, all the elements of nature are against you. And no matter how many wives you marry, you will never be able to have another son. That son she bore for you is your true heir, the one destined to inherit the throne." The king's mind raced, sifting through memories of many women he had been with in his youth He had been with so many, and many had claimed to be pregnant. But who could this woman be? Who was the mother of his only son? Please, how do we find her? The king asked, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. This was his only chance to set things right. His only hope for an heir. Think, the chief priest replied. It's not of me to tell you, but you must find her. The king's mind began to race, and then he began to recall. Chisom. At that moment, the king's heart seemed to stop. The name echoed in his mind, dragging forth memories he had tried to bury deep within. How could he ever forget that name? That face that haunted him in his dreams for years. The one woman who had been different from all the others. Tears welled up in his eyes as he remembered the pain he has caused her. The cruelty of his actions that had driven her away. Now, standing at the edge of his downfall, he realized that his past had finally caught up with him. The evil he had done had come full circle, and the curse that Chisom had placed on him was now the key to his future. How do I find her? He asked again. Her parents are late, but her kinsmen should know her whereabouts. We can ask them, an elder replied. Now at the verge of losing his throne, he knew he had to find her by all means. He just hoped that she would be able to forgive him. The search for Chisom was anything but easy. King Oguguo, desperate to find the son he had never known, pleaded with her kinsmen to tell him about her whereabouts. He sent lots of gifts and even went in person to ask for their forgiveness. But their hearts were still filled with bitterness of how the prince had treated them and their daughter. The pain and humiliation they had suffered at his hands lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Plus, Chisom had left strict instructions not to let anyone know her whereabouts. They finally decided to seek Chisom's consent after much pleading from the king, and she gave her permission. Chisom resided in Agba, a great kingdom far away from Udi. King Oguguo was overjoyed. He believed that once he found Chisom, everything would be fine. He gathered so many gifts, fine clothes, gold and other treasures, and with his servants in tow, he set out on a journey to find her. Little did he know that Chisom was now the queen of this powerful kingdom. When they arrived at the palace gates, Oguguo's hopes were high, but Chisom, now a queen in her own right, had no intention of making things easy for him. She refused to see him, and instead ordered her palace guards to let them in, tie them up and flog them mercilessly. The guards carried out her orders without hesitation, and Oguguo and his men were beaten severely. As the lashes fell upon them, Chisom listened from her chamber, her heart filled with a cold satisfaction. The oppressor was finally being oppressed, and she felt that justice was being served. She was avenging her parents. The cries of the king and his servants echoed through the palace, but no mercy was shown. When the guards were finished, they dragged the battered and bruised king and his men out of the palace, throwing them out just as he had done to her parents many years before. King Oguguo had never experienced such humiliation in his entire life. His back throbbed with pain from the lashes, and he rode back to Uli, shame weighing heavily in his heart. and feeling so powerless. For the first time, he truly felt the pain he had inflicted on so many others. He returned to his palace a broken man, weak, sick not only in the body, but in spirit as well. The guilt of his past actions gnawed at him, and for days he was too ill to even rise from his bed. Weeks passed, and though his body began to heal, Oguguo's mind was consumed with thoughts of how to get back his son. He knew that he couldn't give up, not now. He had to find a way to seek Chisom's forgiveness, no matter what it took. He couldn't afford to lose the throne. Determined to make things right, he decided to return to Chisom. But this time, he would not go alone. He would bring the elders of Udi with him, hoping that their presence would soften her heart. When they arrived at Chisom's palace, she finally agreed to see them. But as she stood before Oguguo, her face was hard, her eyes filled with anger. This was not the woman he knew from many years ago. Her eyes blazed with fire. "You are shameless," she spat at him. "You called my womb cursed. You denied me and your child. You humiliated my parents and kinsmen. You took my innocence. You took my innocence in the most painful way. And you threw me out as if I were nothing. And now you're here. For what? The child you called a bastard and asked me to get rid of." The king, along with the elders, fell to their knees, pleading for her forgiveness. But Chisom's heart was still boiling with rage. She had suffered so much because of this man, and now he was here begging for her mercy. What did he expect her to do? To just forgive him? It seemed almost laughable. "I will consider the king's request," Chisom said after a long pause. "But only on one condition. He must be stripped of his royal attire and confess his wrongdoing to the entire village of Udi. After that, he will come here to my land, where I am now queen, and serve me as a commoner for 1 year. He will live without any royal privilege. He will till the soil like a farmer and work so hard to feed himself from the sweat of his own hands. During that time, his advisor will take over Udi. This price he must pay to have his son. He needs to learn humility." The elders gasped in shock. "What? How can you ask this of our king?" one of them protested. "Fine," Chisom snapped, turning back on them. "Leave and never show your face here again." She began to walk away, her anger still simmering. Oguguo, feeling utterly defeated, realized that this was no longer the gentle, kind-hearted girl he had always known. Chisom had changed. Her heart was now as cold as stone, her eyes blazing with the fire of vengeance. But he knew he had no choice. If he wanted his son, he would have to pay the price. With a heavy heart, the king and his entourage journeyed back to Udi. For days, Oguguo could neither sleep nor eat. Chisom's words echoed in his mind, tormenting him. He knew that her demands were harsh, but he also knew that losing his throne and his son would be far worse. After weeks of sleepless nights, he decided that he would do whatever it took to make amends. One night, he called the town crier to gather the villagers in the village square the next morning. When the time came, King Oguguo stood before his people, stripped off his royal attire, and confessed all his past sins. How he had wronged Chisom, how he had mistreated so many women in the village. He apologized to the villagers, to the maidens he had hurt, and to the entire kingdom. For everyone he had taken anything forcefully from, he returned it in double fold. It was the most humiliating moment of his life, but he endured it knowing that it was the only way to get back his son. Then he embarked on the journey of servitude. For 1 full year, Oguguo lived as a commoner in the land of Agba, where Chisom reigned with her husband. He tilled the hard soil, planted crops, and worked on the farm from dawn to dusk. No one treated him like a king, and he had no choice but to endure the harsh treatment he received, as Chisom ensured that he fell to real pain. The once mighty king was now a lowly servant, sucked down to and severely punished when he failed to meet his task. Every single day was a struggle, filled with pain and misery. But Oguguo bore it all, knowing that this was his punishment for the wrongs he had committed. As the days turned into months, the year finally drew to a close. But when the elders came to retrieve their king, Chisom was not done with him. "His heart is wicked," she said, her voice cold, "and it needs cleansing. Therefore, he must fast for 40 days before he can see his son." 40 what? The elders exclaimed, their voices filled with disbelief. "He has done all you asked him to do. Look at him. Our king is dying. He can't make it to 40 days, they pleaded. King Oguguo was losing himself, as the 1 year had been the worst year of his life. "If that's too much price to pay, then you all can leave and never see the prince," Chisom replied, unmoved by their protests. The elders pleaded with her, but she refused to relent. Oguguo was now a shadow of his former self. Still, he agreed to the fast. "I will do it," he said quietly. "You all should go back. I will face my punishment no matter how grievous." But just after 10 days of fasting, Oguguo's body could take no more. He fell seriously ill, his once strong frame now frail and weak. The elders of Udi, along with the villagers, returned to Agba, crying and begging Chisom to have mercy. As they pleaded with her, memories of the past flooded Chisom's mind. The pain of how Oguguo had taken her innocence, how he had cruelly thrown her out. The anger and the hurt she had buried deep within her threatened to rise again. But as she looked into the faces of the villagers, saw their desperation, she knew that the time had come to let go. For the sake of the people, for the sake of her son, Chisom knew she had to forgive Oguguo, even if he deserved no mercy. She hosted the people for the day, and the next morning, she presented her son Ifeanyi to them. He was tall, handsome, the very image of his father, yet so different. He was well raised, kind-hearted, nothing like the man who had caused her so much pain. The entire village rejoiced at the sight of him, for they knew that the future of Udi was now secure. With tears in her eyes, Chisom handed Ifeanyi over to the elders. "Here is a son, and the heir to the throne of Udi," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. King Oguguo, weakened and humbled, could only weep as he thanked her. He had learned a lesson he would never forget, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As the people of Udi marched out of Agba with their new prince, Chisom watched them go, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had fought her battle, and she had won. Her son had returned to where he belonged, and she had found a way to heal, even from the deepest wounds. The past was finally behind her, and her son would take his place in the throne of Udi. Hey besties, thank you for watching this story, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did enjoy making it. I would like you to share your lessons in the comments section, and if you are yet to subscribe to our YouTube channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you get notified whenever we post new stories. Thank you for all your love, all your support, all your encouragement. They mean a lot to me. Right now, I'll have to go and see you in the next story. Bye!